Welcome to Manabil. Hope you're doing well. I thought I would take a little time to discuss the idea of dualism, the combination problem, dissociation problem, even, and um, I think it's called monism, but sort of trying to get a grasp of what we're dealing with here, right? This is sort of a discussion of the deeper levels of metaphysics, you could say. When we are using the big knife, right, slicing things up in dichotomies and sort of starting points and reduction bases, and we are in that area, um, at least close to, right? uh, the most famous dualist possibly would be Descartes, right? Who, by doing his Cartesian doubt, ended up saying, okay, so there is something that it's like to experience and colors and sounds, but it seems there are also something outside myself that are object and physical and conforms to laws, physical laws and scientific descriptions and so on. While my taste of pudding is not a part of that description, so to say. So there must be two kinds. There must be mind kind and, for lack of a better term, matter kind, right? That's why the idea of the problem of mind and matter, or mind over matter, or matter over mind, or whatever, arrives. And that is dualist because it appeals to there are fundamentally at least two different kinds of what term would you use, right? Two different kinds of stuff, right? Okay, um, then that is potentially basically a materialist point of view, right? That there's sort of mind area, and outside mind area there's matter area, right? Okay, then if you think about it, if there's mind, as I pointed out in my recent videos and in also my deconstructions, my presentations of my metaphysics and deconstructions of Bernardo Kastrup and so on, I've pointed out that that there is a paradox built into that particular kind of dualist approach, right? Which is, if your experiences are within your mind and you're claiming an outside of your mind and describing that outside, how do you get to do that? Because if that inside has to be there as an experience in order for you to have anything to refer to and be aware of, then that which you are aware of must be in the same realm as the awareness, so sort of in your mind, so to say, right? So you do not have access to some outside, right? And therefore, why are you saying there's an outside all of a sudden, right? Where is that outside? How did that arrive? Well, it was basically habitual thinking. So when you're sort of retracting from this dualist, materialist worldview, you end up in sort of, well, all I have is access to some experiences, right? And some might argue that awareness and experience is in itself dualist. You could possibly argue that. I mean, I wouldn't. I mean, I couldn't argue against it, I would say, right? I mean, I might be able to sort of say, I don't think it matters. I think that it has to be at least within the same realm, so to say, right? And if there are two different kinds, okay, maybe it is, right? But that's not what we're dealing with when we're doing dualism, right? That is all outside both awareness and experience, right? Both consciousness and meta-consciousness, to use another term, right? So when you're then retracting from the paradox of materialism, you're sort of left with only, as I pointed out in a recent video, or the video before this one, that you end up in a situation where you only have the inside quote, right? And then you also must realize, well, then there is no inside-outside dichotomy. I can't say there isn't, but I have lost the outside part of that dichotomy, because I'm only referring to that inside. So what makes me say there is an outside? Well, it was just habitual thinking in my prior materialist approach. So you're left with sort of, then there's only sort of the mind aspect, right? So why do I need to call it mind? Well, I don't. I have experiences and I'm aware of those experiences, right? I don't have to call it something new in order to explain anything, because that would just be a superfluous additional term that might bring in some connotations that I don't need, or I don't want to, unless I want to, screw with other people's minds, right? And pretend that it's philosophy. So, but there's just this thing, and when nobody, this is sort of a solipsist approach. If you say I have awareness and I have experience and I'm aware of that experience, if you don't put any further interpretation into that experience you're aware of, then you're basically solipsist. But I can't work in an everyday treating my experience solipsistically. I have to give it meaning, in my opinion. That's my philosophy, right? Do your own, right? Just presenting how I approach it, and you might be inspired by it, right? So I'm saying there is this experience. If I'm not giving meaning to it, why? So that's not. I was going to say why is it there, but that's not a good argument. But it's there when in your waking hours, right? Even if possibly when you're sleeping, there's also something going on, right? But dreaming and so on. But in another sense, that it's just I am constantly drawn to giving meaning to this experience. I'm constantly trying to give it an understanding, right? And it's inevitable. Even if I didn't want to do it, I would do it anyway, right? And because I have this urge, I have to do something about it. And that's why I have the idea, that's why there is at all the idea of philosophy, in my opinion, right? Because when you're doing philosophy, you're basically saying, okay, now I'm going to attempt to give a complete meaning and understanding and categorization and classification and whatever you need of that experience. What the hell am I going to do with it, right? If you're solipsist, you're not philosophizing, right? As soon as you start to philosophize and give, quote, meaning, and meaning might not be the best term here, but for a lack of a better term, then you're philosophizing when you're starting to give meaning to that experience you're aware of, right? Okay, so far, so good. When you start to give meaning to it, I'm retracting the term meaning. When you're trying to, meaning is not the best term, because it's sort of, it's like it's a sort of a transcendental manual to my experiences or anything like that. It would approach that, and I want really to avoid that, because there's no meaning arriving from the outside in my estimation, right, or in my philosophy. Because otherwise I wouldn't need to philosophize, you could say, right? And you could also say, okay, there is meaning to it. You're just eluding yourself that you can philosophize about it, right? It's all given to you. But then you're creating some outside thing inflicting itself, which you can't deduce from that experience alone, right? And then you go in, then it becomes this kind of mystic approach, right? So in order to avoid that, you have to do it from the inside, so to say. You have to start in your awareness and look at quote, your experience and try, okay, but how do I approach this? How do I approach that? And so on, right? I think that, to cut this a bit short, there's no way, at least for me, as I pointed out in the prior video, there's no way for me to avoid appealing to something outside my experiences. I personally I wouldn't say I can't avoid it. It's like, I guess I have to do it. It's not in that sense, right? It's more like the only way I can make some sense of it in a way that is useful to me is to create an outside. And the outside is the only aspect I have access to is treating at least some part of my experience as representations of an outside. I don't know if there's an outside. I can't get to that outside, right? I only have this, marionette theater of things moving about in my experience that I treat as if they're representations of an outside, right? Now, is that a dualist approach? Is that a dualist approach? At this point, I would say you could possibly argue both, right? Because you're not inventing something extra by saying I'm treating these as representations of an outside, because it's just an abstraction. You are saying, you're not saying, yes, and I'm reached this wall and I can't get any further, but it means there's something different out there. That's not what you're doing when you're doing it this way, as I'm pointing out. I'm just saying I have these experiences and I'm going to treat them as representations of something I don't have access to. So I'm sort of combining dualism and monism, right? I'm staying within my experiences. I'm just treating them as representations of something I don't have access to, right? And I don't even necessarily have to say it's something outside, right? As if there's a sort of sharp delineation between something that it's beyond and that which it is, right? And I think it's the most healthy approach, because you are staying on the safe side of not claiming more than you can actually have access to, right? That you're going to treat your experience. I mean, I'm describing my own experience. I can't get to somebody else's experience, right? I can't even say if there's something else that those I call my representations is actually based on something out there, right? But I'm treating it as such because that gives meaning, and it gives it's rational to me to do it. So I'm rationalizing my philosophy, you could say. I mean, you can't avoid that. You can't avoid that, right? If you give a pretense that you can derive all sorts of universal, quote, shit about your experience and inflict it on somebody else, then you're deluding yourself. And you should be aware of people doing that. And that's by far the most prevalent approach to philosophy. To be honest, I have never really seen anybody else approaching philosophy the way I'm doing it. By axiom, right? By saying, well, I don't have to prove I have free will. I am deciding I have free will, right? I don't have to prove it to you, right? If you don't want free will, then be my guest, right? I'm not going to, trust you, right? But you can't tell me what I should think and what I should decide to work from, right? So it's the fetish with, I have to prove this philosophically because that's what I've been trained to do. And it has to be an authority. This is how you do it. The 12 rules for life or whatever, right? Rather than saying, well, I'm doing my own philosophy, right? And I've been down this road before, and I will be a very big proponent of doing your own philosophy, right? If you can't do it yourself, you can't trust somebody else, right? Because you would have to have a good philosophy of your own in order to say, of course I can trust what somebody else tells me. And if you're trusting what somebody else tells me, that which they're telling you is exactly where you're lacking in your philosophy. And then you're just adapting that which you cannot figure out yourself. No, that doesn't work. because then you might just be eating something raw that you either want to be there or just for, it sounds great, I'm just going to adapt to that, right? No, I will always be a proponent of you should think for yourself. You should, in the best case scenario, you should have a fully formed, complete philosophy, a treatise of your own, before you start to judge somebody else. It's probably impossible in the sense that you might need some inspiration and ideas from some other thinkers presenting their thinking in order to say, yeah, that's an interesting point. I didn't think of that before. I need to go and think about that, right? So it's sort of bouncing left and right? Bouncing, big balls are bouncing, right? ACDC. I lost my train of thought there. Yes, get back to the dualism and so on. Okay, so when in my approach, saying that I'm treating my experiences as representations doesn't entail that I need to go and explain that which these experiences might be based on, right? So I can't get to it. I can never get to it because I'm locked within my experiences, right? And if they're not experiences, I don't have access to them, so it doesn't matter, right? But I'm staying on the right side of things because all I have is, qualifying, classifying, treating, deciding, rationalizing about these experiences I have. And that nobody can take away from me, right? I can't tell you, or I can't tell to myself whether or not somebody else has these kinds of experiences. It seems likely because in the way I behave, it seems there are parts of my experience that could be representations of the same kind of thing that I experience, right? My body and my head and so on. These are representations in my mind of something that is the actual me outside, which I do not have access to, which is a kind of a unsettling notion, right? But there's no way around it. And there are similar kinds out there that seems to be cognized the same way I cognize myself. So it's rational to treat them as if they have the same kind of experience as I have. So that's why you are very quickly moving into some kind of ethics, right? And necessity for what it means to know something, what it means that whatever is you meant by objective, for instance, and subjective, and so on, right? And it all leads there, in my opinion, very quickly when you settle on metaphysics, right? So if you stay with that, which I'm pointed out here, I have my experiences, I treat them as representations, but I'm only going to classify these representations or these experiences that I treat as representations. And I'm only going to refer to whatever is part of this experience. Then I'm both a monist and a dualist, you could say, right? I am creating an imaginary external world where shit is going on that I have a representation of. But I can never get to the actual thing. I have to stay with my representations, right? When we get to saying, okay, well, I'm going to, if you want to stay the materialist says, okay, when I have experiences of what I call matter within my experience, that is what is out there. They say matter is out there, right? But that's the fallacy. That's the paradox of materialism. That doesn't work, right? That is you can quickly refute that, right? Okay, so what Bernardo Kastrup then does is, in my opinion, even worse. The monist, idealist, analytic, whatever, right? Objective idealism, whatever he calls it, analytic idealism. He says, all of that which goes on, my awareness and my experiences, I will put them in a bag and call them mind. And then I will say, they are made of mind, because I gave it that label, in the same fashion as saying, well, that's a car. Those wheels, that box, those leather seats, I will call that car. So now I have explained what car is made of, because I'm going to say that car is made of car, right? Just as he says, well, it is all made of mind. Awareness and experiences are made of mind, because I called it mind. You see the linguistic trick, right? And then he says, okay, I don't like dualism, because then I would run into the so-called combination problem, which is, how does this, whatever you claim is out there, become that in there, right? Which is sort of alluding to the hard problem. How does whatever, however you say is there and how you describe it, matter and energy, whatever you call it, quantum, this, that, and the other, how does that become the smell of roses? The hard problem, right? So that kind of trying to tell anybody what is beyond their experiences, as if it's the same kind of, as it's an available area to describe in some kind of manner, just as you're describing your experience, maybe, right? It's just different stuff. That doesn't work, because you're running into the hard problem. And how do you combine experiences with matter and energy, so to say, right? It seems impossible. That combination problem, is it a combination problem? I think it's called the combination problem, but that, you know what I mean, right? So what Bernardo then does is, I know that my awareness and my experience is made of mind. What if that which is outside my mind is also made of mind, right? Then I'm not a dualist. And I have explained that outside, while I still have my inside, right? Because to avoid dualism, there's only one other option, according to this kind of thinking, which is it must then be of the same kind. So if there's only avenue to try to describe that outside, then you have to say it's mind, right? There's only one way to go and say that while you are saying time, avoid the combination problem. It's also mind out there, right? While forgetting that you were just screwing around with the terms you'd use to describe both awareness and experience as mind, and then twisting the word around and saying, I guess it's made of mind then, right? You see this sort of linguistic juggling that Bernardo Kastrup does. It's not philosophical. It's sophist. It's sophistry. It's using the words to your advantage and bringing in hidden meanings and understandings, twisting them round and changing categories, and without you noticing it. It's sort of a shell game, or what's it called? A magician. Look at this while they're doing something else down here, right? It is basically it's philosophical magician, right? That's a sophist. By using the tool is using words in a way that screws around the meaning in order to get you to get a particular understanding without they actually stating it as a philosophical statement, right? Just twisting the words around and bringing in particular meanings without a direct, clear-cut philosophical statement. Now, then the next question is that sort of is a big part of what Bernardo Kastrup does is, then if it's all mind, why can't I experience that which is outside my mind? Why is there an inside and an outside if it's all the same thing? If you look at a glass of water, you can't pinpoint to that water is outside that water. That's stupid, right? So he comes up with okay, so he has been scouring the internet or whatever, and finding something he calls dissociative identity disorder, which is some people claiming that their mind is splitting up, and there are some, they're not even claiming it maybe, but those who are, putting electrodes on them are claiming that there are two minds in there or something like that, right? Which is highly contentious and highly, controversial, right? Which is something I dealt with in a video 3 or 4 videos back, where I deal with Bernardo-Castro's dissociative identity disorder and the problems in that, right? So he says, there's some magical dissociation. Your mind is just cut off from the rest of mind. And the only thing he has to go with is there's a particular woman in Germany or whatever, right? Who, bumped her head into her car or whatever, right? And all of a sudden, when her eyes are open, she's apparently not seeing something, or the mind doesn't light up. And therefore, dissociation, right? It's sort of the opposite of the combination. If it's the same thing, you don't need to combine them. But if there's an inside outside, you have to dissociate them now, right? In the opposite direction. So it's the same problem, just in the opposite direction, so to say. So he's coming up with some kind of dissociation that is not given what that is made of. How does that work? Well, he's just saying, well, it's there. The woman in Germany, right? How could you have sort of, if in the metaphor, and please bear in mind, it's a metaphor. How could you look at a glass of water and then say, well, it's water over here, it's water over there, but there's a dissociation there. You see, the left water and the right water, it's dissociated, right? You couldn't make that dissociation without bringing in some other stuff that is responsible for the dissociation, in my opinion. And I don't trust these reporting. Reporting can never be a foundation of metaphysics in the first place, or epistemology for that matter, or ethics for that matter even, right? It can never be the basis of metaphysics. And somebody, a few measurements on the head, and somebody claiming this, that, and the other, and then claiming that there's some kind of dissociation in that mind in there that nobody can experience anyway, other than their own experiences and awareness of whatever they have in their experience, and then using that and say, aha, of course there are dissociations, right? I don't buy that. Because if you have to dissociate, there must be something different from mind that is responsible for that dissociation, and voila, then you have dualism, right? So it doesn't work, in my opinion. It is even worse than treating your experiences as a direct outside, which is sort of naive realism, right? It's even worse than that, because that at least you are anchored in what you can experience, right? When you're going into this monist analytic idealism with this magical dissociation thing going on, right? It's all sort of grabbed out of somebody's ass. It's not something I can't experience a dissociation, right? I only, it's like saying, yeah, I have an infinite experience of universe, but I can't get to a dissociation somewhere in that experience, because I'm only half of the experience then, right? There's my experience, and then there's something beyond my experience that is also apparently some kind of experience or whatever. And I understand that. I'm not sure I understand, but if you have to leave your experiences behind, which is what you do when you start to talk about what is beyond your experiences, by definition, you are leaving your sanity behind, right? Because sanity is reflecting on your experiences, right? And not listening to a particular part of your experience, like sounds and voices and language and interpretations, and letting that direct you towards how you should understand your experiences, right? Which in itself is a circular argument. You will always have a solipsist ground floor right? That is your starting point, your Cartesian ground floor, right? But it doesn't mean you should stay there necessarily, right? Then you can start and classify your experiences using philosophical rigidity. And the only way I can see that is functional in giving understanding to my experience is to treat it as a representation of something else, right? And that else, I do not, the thing itself, as somebody would call it, I do not have access to. So I have to stay with my judgment, my understanding of this experience. Whenever I talk about something, I will always be talking about my experiences in some way or another, right? That might be also a cognition, right? Elephant, rather than just color or sound, right? And further derivatives from that, further abstractions from that, but they're all anchored in my experience at the end. And the reduction base is the ground floor of that experience. And the ground floor is always traceable in any statement or any classification. Further classification of your experiences should always be directly traceable back to that foundational reduction base of your experience, right? Then you're doing good philosophy, in my opinion. Now, there might be one point that I might mention that is an aspect of this approach that I have. That if you adapt this approach, you might be so annoyed by the idea of, let's say, a realm beyond your experiences you can't get to, that you're it's so annoying that you can't get to it, because as an urge in a human being is that I don't want something to be unexplored, so to say, right? I don't want something to be unexplained. I must be able to access it, right? No, you have to stay on the right side of things here, right? You have to hands off, right? You know, it's tempting to go and say, like Bernard, oh, there are ripples and pure subjectivity and abstractions like that is purely dragged out of his ass, right? You have to leave it alone. You have to be firm and stay with your experiences, right? And how you handle them. So, that's what I had. See you in the next one.